Thank you, Michal, for this introduction. It's easy to remember with the same name, I guess. But yeah, it's really nice to see you, everybody, that you've come to my session. Or rather, I can't really see you, and you didn't really come anywhere. But it's still nice to know that you've decided to tune in to this. So yes, my name's Michal Muskala, and I work at a big tech company. And I look like that on the internet. And I worked with Elixir for many, many years. I think by now it'll probably be around 4 or 5. I think I started just around 1.0 was released. But in my new job, I'm working primarily with Erlang. And you might know me maybe better from my most popular package, which is JSON. And right now it's the most popular package on Hex. And it passed over 20 million downloads and is downloaded more than 100,000 times a day, which is extremely shocking to me and very humbling. So thank you, everybody, for those of you who decided to use it, for using it. But yeah, going a bit more concrete, after many years of Elixir, I now, for the last 9 months, have been working primarily with Erlang. And I wanted to share with you some things that I noticed, some things that I miss, and I think could be much better in Erlang, some things that I don't miss, but I thought I would from working earlier with Elixir, and also a couple things that I think are much better in Erlang. And what I would like to kind of preface this everything is that it's not that I wasn't familiar with Erlang before I started my current job. I contributed many times to the Erlang parts of the Elixir compiler. I also contributed to Erlang itself, with probably the highlight being the map get and ismap key structs guard safe functions that power the awesome new features in Elixir, which are like the map.key access in guards and the isstruct new guards that Jose mentioned yesterday at his session. So now going back to the main topic, I would like to start with kind of a high-level overview how I feel about both languages after working with both of them a bit more. Is that I feel like Erlang to me feels much more fundamental and raw, and at the same time a bit more basic, something where you kind of have to do more things yourself. And Elixir, to contrast, feels more playful and kind of more open, I think. And like all those things aren't necessarily good or bad, but I want to kind of underline that there are different qualities about those languages. And I'd like to kind of expand of why I feel that in the following slides. But what I wanted to make really clear is that from my experience working with both languages, they're both very serious languages that allow building extremely scalable systems which are reliable, easy to maintain, and are all both great choice for using in core systems of a whole company. So yes, I want to start with a bit more ranty session with things I miss from Elixir. I hope I won't get too ranty and won't offend too many people. And the first thing I want to talk about is probably not very much a surprise because it's something that's underlined often about Erlang, which is documentation, right? And some qualities about the Elixir documentation that I think are important is a lot of excellent examples, beautiful design, and overall kind of a delightful experience, right? So an experience that you get with some products that seem to be designed to do exactly what you need them to do, and they just work. And this is my experience using the Elixir documentation. But kind of just bashing on Erlang documentation, it was almost kind of a meme in the Erlang community. So I wanted to kind of expand a bit more on that and what I think is missing, kind of also underline some recent changes. Yes, so this attention to detail. But I think something that's not talked a lot about in terms of how a documentation Elixir works is that it's very uniform, right? Whenever you want to look at documentation for core packages like Elixir, IEX, Mix, or some packages from the community like Phoenix, Ecto, they all look the same, work the same. You have very uniform experience. You always know where to go to look for the documentation, right? You don't need to go through like hundreds of different readmes, random websites with like hit and miss design, or some wikis on GitHub, or who knows what else, right? And I think this gives a huge edge to Elixir in terms of productivity day to day. It's kind of this easiness to access any documentation in exactly the same way. And this is something that I miss a lot in Erlang, right? Even if we like discard all the kind of nice things, right? Like the examples, design, and all of that, I think this uniformity part of Elixir documentation and the Elixir ecosystem documentation is really missing for me in Erlang, right? And something I really wanted to say is that the Erlang documentation is getting much, much better recently, right? So over the last couple of releases, we had like small annotations with versions when a particular function was introduced, button to edit the code directly on GitHub. And now OTP 23 made a huge step integrating the Erlang Enhancement Proposal 48 and the uniform documentation format for all the Beam languages. So you can easily interoperate or like access Erlang documentation from Elixir shell, Elixir documentation from Erlang shell, or whatever you would want, right? So kind of creating common tooling for all our languages. But what I would want to underline is that this integration through ecosystem, I think, is the key that makes Elixir documentation work so well. So what I would really like to see is some first-class documentation support in the Erlang compiler, right? So you don't need to use specific tools like Rebar. You don't need to bring extra packages like edoc. It's just there, you compile, and it's there and it works. But with all the great work on this, I would really like to thank the Erlang Ecosystem Foundation Documentation Working Group. There's a lot of people from the Elixir team, the OTP team, and the community working really hard on making this much better. The second part I wanted to talk about is testing. And this one was really surprising to me. And my general kind of assessment is that testing in Erlang is really disappointing. And it's surprising. So I have to kind of caveat that this is mostly based on my experience with common test. I haven't used eUnit much yet, but my understanding is that for most of the points I'm going to make, it's kind of similar. Right? And this is, again, kind of a meme that error messages in Erlang are bad. But I would want to expand a bit on why I think error messages in Elixir are good in comparison. Right? So I think there are two parts of that. One, there's standardized error printing mechanisms. So you have standard library functions to print the stack trace and error messages in a nice way for console and for human consumption, and this is used uniformly in all the tooling, right? And this gives kind of this uniformity again, gives a huge advantage. And when you see a stack trace, you know it's a stack trace and not a nested list of tuples and who knows what else is there, right? And this uniformity allows for some extra tooling like the clause diffing, right, that you have on function clause errors when in Elixir. When in Erlang, when you get function clause errors, it's kind of like an oh no moment, right? You need to go to the code, explore everything, and you kind of don't know what you need to do. Whereas in Elixir, it prints you the function heads in console with exactly which, for each head, which argument did not match or which guard failed. And you can, in many cases, you can almost immediately fix the thing that went wrong without this kind of overhead. And the second part of this is extensible errors, right? So errors in Erlang are usually plain atoms or tuples, which is great for kind of programmatic handling of errors, but it's very bad when you need to extend them, right? And this is very much visible in ETS. So ETS errors are terrible, right? Whatever you do wrong, whether it's like a mistake in your match spec, or the table is not even started, or the table is private or protected and you don't have access to the particular operation, you get bedark, right? It's bedark and that's it, right? Good luck figuring out what went wrong. And it's really hard to fix it, right? Because if you change the error messages, you break all the code that directly matches on them, right? So there's no mechanism to safely extend the errors, the error values with additional information. On the other side, in Elixir, it's very easy because errors are structs normally. So you can very easily add a new field to a struct or to a map, how it's represented at runtime, and it doesn't really break the code where you're matching on other things. So I think this is kind of the second problem. And the really surprising thing for me in testing story in Erlang was how relatively poor is the support for testing in parallel. So this is something I've been used in XUnit, in Elixir, in the ecosystem. There's a lot of emphasis put on being able to test in parallel, right? So in Ecto, you can even run tests that hit database in parallel. In the mocking framework, mocks, you can run the mocks, you can mock modules, and it also works with many tests running in parallel. And it just speeds up your test suites, right? And in Erlang, at least in common test, but my understanding is that in Unit, it looks pretty similar, at least from reading documentation. You have a very elaborate support for running tests in parallel, right? You can create groups that some run in parallel, some run sequentially. It's a lot of power that you get, but it misses to exploit the main source of parallelism, which is running multiple test suites in parallel, right? So multiple modules, running tests from multiple modules in parallel. And in Elixir, in XUnit, this is the only parallelism in explorers, right? It doesn't have any fine-grained tuning of the test parallelism. It's basically only running multiple modules in parallel, but it works so well and is completely missing in the Erlang ecosystem. And it makes your test just slow, right? So in my day-to-day work, I use a 24-core server with like 60 gigabytes of RAM, and all that is running just one test at a time. Like it's just a bit depressing. And kind of as a last small point, the interfaces are a bit clunky, especially the default CLI for common test, the config files that it has, like accessing some things through macros. You need to define test name 3 times, right? Once you need to export the function, then you need to define it to belong to some group, and finally you define the test itself. So it comes very repetitive, and there's a lot of kind of boilerplatey extra stuff that shouldn't really be needed. And I have to say rebar helps a lot in here, and it does pretty good job, but sometimes the details leak, right? And it's not so obvious what's happening. So I'm glad to say that, as you probably heard, I feel really strong about this. And in a recent meeting with the OTP team, I committed to doing something about this, not only ranting at a conference. So I guess now I'm committing it even a bit more publicly. I have to say that I'm not known for making my projects arrive like kind of the fastest, at least my spare time projects. JSON was probably like a year and a half in the making. So if there's somebody that also feels strongly about this and wants to collaborate with me on this, I'll be really happy to talk to you. And the last kind of smallest feature that I think I miss from Elixir is inspect. And it's not a big thing, but it's again something that helps kind of in the small things that you're trying to do. So it provides legible data structures in the shell, right? If you ever tried to read a record with 20 fields in the shell that is printed as a tuple, and half of the fields have value of undefined, then you really know what I'm talking about, right? You have no idea what's going on, and it's very hard to understand what's happening. And as an extra thing, it also allows for easy information hiding, right? So this is used in standard library in Elixir a lot. For example, mapset, it hides its internal structure because it's private, so it can be changed from one release to another and only operated through functions. And you can document this, and in Erlang it's often documented, right? Saying, well, like through either dialyzer opaque types or just in documentation. But then if you get this printed in shell with the exact structure, you don't really feel that you're not supposed to use it, right? It's very easy to misuse it by accident just because you saw how it looks like. So I think this is one small thing with a lot of potential. So now for a bit more hopeful part of this, I want to talk about things I like about Erlang. And the first thing might be a bit surprising, but I actually like Erlang syntax. I think it's much cleaner and more concise than Elixir syntax. And don't get me wrong, right? There's plenty of things in the Erlang syntax I'm not a fan of. And I'm in particular speaking of you and also and or else. And I still often forget punctuation, right? I will still misplace my dots and commas and semicolons. But overall, how the code looks like and the shape of it, I really, really like it. That kind of, it also in many cases avoids additional nesting. And I think this is an advantage. The second part that I'm really happy about is kind of the inner working of the language, which is the compiler. Even though Elixir and Erlang share huge parts of the compiler, right? Most of it is the same beyond the front end. The Erlang compiler is much, much faster. And not really on the initial build, but on rebuilds. And this comes directly from features in the Elixir language, like import and macros and compile time execution that create a lot of dependencies between modules. And if you're not careful, it's easy to end up in a situation in a bigger project where you change one file and 300 files need to be recompiled. And by contrast, in Erlang, those situations are rather rare. Right? Usually, if you change one module, you just change this module, recompile this module, unless it's a behavior, bounce transform, or header, which are relatively rarely used compared to like those dependencies appearing in Elixir. And don't get me wrong, error messages in the Erlang compiler are also not particularly good. Right? If you have a long line with like some data structure and the compiler tells you error after comma on line X, and you have to kind of wonder which comma it means, right? So there are some things that I think could be significantly improved, but the thing that it's so fast, it greatly improves the productivity, and I really like it. And the third thing that I like about Erlang that I wanted to mention is kind of the small training wheels or the small assistance you can get working with the language. And this is a very recent development. And this is Erlang LS. So this is Erlang language server, which provides kind of a cross-platform intelligence provider for your editor or your IDE. There's code completion, like error highlighting, and a lot more things to make working with Erlang day-to-day better. And it's still early in its state, but already improved my experience of working with Erlang so much that if you haven't really looked at it, I would really strongly recommend you do, because I think it's a really awesome tool with a great roadmap and great features planned. So I think Erlang, it's very possible, I think realistic for Erlang to get really best in the kind of best in class editor experience with Erlang LS. So I wanted to kind of end with this kind of a cheesy rhyme, right? That the future is bright when the Beam people unite, right? Even though we live, our communities, the Erlang Elixir community, live close to one another, mix often, and interact frequently, I think there's still a lot to be learned from one another, from tooling, from language, from the communities. And I think there's a lot of potential in it. So this was my experience report from Elixir to Erlang. And now I'll be happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Michal. Very interesting, informative talk. I have one question for you. So if you may share, so what would be your editor of choice, which might be likely to also support this new language server of Erlang? Can you share some details of what is it that you have running?
So I use VS Code, but I know that my other team members that work on the language server directly, I think are a big fan of Emacs. So that works as well. And I think now on the website with documentation, there are instructions to set it up with Vim and with many other editors. So this cross-platform experience of setting it up, I think really pays off. That it's kind of, you only need a tiny glue layer from your editor and you get all those awesome features.
Okay, thank you. We have some more questions from our audience. Which one do you like the most, Erlang or Elixir, Ben?
I'm not sure I can pick one. I think both are really good at kind of what they do, mostly because of libraries and the ecosystem and things like that. So if I were to write a web app, I would choose Phoenix like without any hesitation, right? I would choose Phoenix, I would use Ecto and use Elixir for that. On the other hand, If I were to write some protocol handling code and things like that, I think the conciseness of Erlang syntax and the kind of less noisy syntax works really well in those kind of scenarios.
Thank you. There is another one here. Have you written any Erlang macros at all? Blink.
Yes, I did, and I got bitten by them as well a couple times. So yes, macros do tend to result in situations where you scratch your head saying like, it's impossible that this is happening. And then you see that kind of its macros and precedence, for example, of operators was wrong because it was hidden by macros. So there's a lot of things like that. I've also had to deal a lot with macros working on the ErlFMT project, the Erlang formatter that is now open source. As one of the goals, I had to handle macros, or at least sane subset of macros correctly. So yeah, I had to think a lot about macros in the last couple of months.
We have some time for more questions, so I will keep asking. Another one. Doesn't Erlang LS fall into the same category as Elixir LS, which uses the language server protocol to provide great discoverability?
Yes, it's exactly the same kind of system. So this one wasn't really kind of something I like in Erlang that I don't like in Elixir. It's just something I really like in Erlang, that it is there, that wasn't really there like a year ago or year and a half ago when I was working on some contributions, some smaller contributions to OTP or the Elixir compiler. So this is a recent development that I'm a really huge fan of. But
there is another one here. What do you think about the new code formatter? Any plan to merge the two projects with the one you presented recently in San Francisco?
So I don't really want to go into many details in here, but there are kind of different goals behind the project. So the Rebar 3 format is very much configurable and you can tweak almost everything, whereas ErlFMT is very opinionated in what it supports. And it's primarily inspired by how Elixir formatter works, with kind of this user-guided formatting where you can switch between multiple formats with kind of hinting that the formatter what you want it to do instead of having options.
Then we have a question, I think it's a follow-up to the macro question. What about parse transforms?
Yeah, that's a can of worms. So in general, as a feature, I feel they're not that bad, right? Where they become bad is kind of the same place where Elixir macros become bad, and this is debugging, right? Where something goes wrong, it's very hard to understand what's going on. And the advantage of Elixir macros is that the something going wrong is localized, right? So you at least know the area where you call the macro, that it's there when it's going wrong. And if you have a parse transform, it can go wrong anywhere in the module, right? Because it's kind of global, or if you turn it global on the whole project, then it can go wrong anywhere. So I think that's kind of problematic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Michal, you have quite a few more questions, so can I ask you to revisit our session Q&A tab and address the other questions as well? And thank you once again very much for a very informative talk. That's all for this session. See you soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. See you all.